So now that we understand what our body needs to do, now let's put the club in our hands and start to add that additional motion. So this is the motion that we've got to add in. There's a little hinging of the wrists, folding of the right arm, and a little bit of rotation of the right forearm as well as the left forearm. So what it ends up looking like, if I blend it all together, so we're going to have the turn. Now we get here and we begin to hinge, and as we're hinging, that's rotating, and now we've got a backswing that looks like a backswing. Okay, so that looks pretty simple. So it's turn, begin to hinge once the butt of the club gets even with your right leg. So you're hinging and you're rotating all at the same time. And that puts the club up on plane. Now, what are some variations we see from players? Well, we could hinge but not have any rotation of our forearms. And what that will give us, so we turn, we hinge, and we have no rotation of our forearms. That gives us an across the line look, somewhat like what you see Matthew Wolf doing. So what he's actually doing is he's keeping his left arm, what's called externally rotated, all the way to the top of the backswing. So he doesn't let his left arm have any rotation. So it looks like this. Okay, so there's no rotation. That's okay. It's not my preference because there's some things that have to happen. You have to be pretty athletic and you have to have a really good transition to make it work. But it can work. He's the best player in college. What other things do we see? We also see players who get it back here, everything looks pretty good. Then they have a lot of rotation, so they wind up with the club going into a laid off position. That can also work. We just need to have a good pivot and very passive hands to get the club back into the right arc. So if our bodies are working correctly and we're gaining side bend, depth in the pelvis, and we have a good transition, we can get away with a lot of different things in the backswing. Now those two would not be my preference. I would prefer to see the club get up and be in a little more inline condition, a little less rerouting to have happen, but you can get away with a lot. So you don't necessarily have to have a perfect backswing to be a really good ball striker. Now if you decide that what you're doing in your backswing is hurting you, let's talk about how you go about fixing it. So the thing I've had the most success with is trying to exaggerate the opposite. So if your tendency is to turn your shoulders too flat, let's exaggerate the feeling of turning your shoulders really steep, okay? If your tendency is to have too much forearm roll and get the club laid off, let's have the feeling of no forearm roll. So you're going to feel like as you take this club back, you're not letting it rotate at all. You're going to feel like Matthew Wolf. You'll never look like it. And it's really important that you have some system of feedback, whether it be a mirror, or you video your golf swing, or you download an app like Mirror Vision. You've got to be able to see what you're doing. Because what you feel like you do and what you actually do are never the same. So one of my favorite drills here is actually just to set up a station kind of like what I've got here, put a tee in the butt into the golf club to give me some perspective. Now, my preference for a window of where the club should point in the backswing would be somewhere between the target line and my toes. Anywhere in that window I would say is very acceptable. If you start the club back and you get it where it's when your left arm's parallel and you have that club pointing outside of the target line, that's typically going to be a problem, because what's going to want to happen is you're going to have the momentum of the club trying to reroute the club head. So ideally, I would like to see that club, or that butt into the grip, you can see that tee's pointing down kind of toward the line there, and that would be halfway between and down toward my toes. Anywhere in there I would say would be really acceptable. So this is a good little drill and way to check yourself. So if you just make a backswing, now check. Where do you have it? And you can also video yourself and watch and see if you have any lateral bump in your hips, or if you're moving too much forward this way. You know, it's really important to have some form of feedback so you can see what's going on and then try to exaggerate the opposite. Now let's talk a little bit about what the club face should be doing in a backswing. So ideally, I want to see that club face fairly square to my spine angle at this point, and then from here on, what's happening is my wrists are hinging, and that face should be relatively square to my left arm. And I want to see my left wrist kind of flattening out. So what I don't want to see is I don't want to see it working this way. Your right wrist should hinge, and at the top it should be kind of under the club like this, which puts your left wrist into a little flatter condition than where it started. If I start like this, I've got a little cupping in my left wrist, and my right wrist is flat. So now as I take it back, if that's reversing, now I've got a little cupping in my right wrist, and my left wrist is flattening. Ideally, that's what we're seeing. So if we can get the club into somewhat the right position at the top with the face fairly neutral, with a good transition, things are going to work out. And that's what we'll talk about next time.